Hello, everybody. We are on Unit 5, Day 3, and we're going to be talking about the battles of the Civil War. We are going to move very, very quickly today. You're going to see a lot of times that the AP exam does not really focus on the battles. They focus on the causes and effects of wars, but there are some key things that are generally included in the AP exam from the actual war itself. So, we left off with Stonewall Jackson and the Battle of First Manassas, where he gets his claim to fame there, and the Confederate victory in the Battle of First Manassas. Now, General McClellan, he would move 100,000 troops to Eastern Virginia. His hope was to hopefully invade and be able to take over Richmond and the war be over. McClellan would be very slow in moving on Richmond, which would allow the Confederates time to counterstrike. Now, one of the things that the Confederate leadership had done was taken Stonewall Jackson and moved his army to the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley was known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy because you had a ton of crops grown there, and really they helped feed the Confederacy throughout the Civil War. Stonewall Jackson there, using a small force that he had at his disposal, was basically able to confuse and outmarch and use superior strategy to be able to fool the Union Army in the Shenandoah Valley over and over and over. And you're going to see that Stonewall Jackson already achieved some fame because of the Battle of First Manassas, but really the Valley Campaign is what is going to solidify his status as a hero within the Confederacy and as a brilliant military tactician. He was able to do that in a variety of ways, with marching his men really quickly, using the mountains to his advantage to kind of shield his movements and to surprise the Union Army. So because of that, that is actually going to require McClellan to send 30,000 troops to the Shenandoah Valley to help deal with Jackson in the valley. Now, Jackson would eventually leave the Shenandoah Valley to turn to Richmond to help assist in the 7 days battles there. 7 days battles, again, this is another attempt by McClellan to hopefully be able to put pressure on Richmond and be able to take Richmond. Overall, they would be a massive failure for McClellan. He would constantly be on the retreat and then eventually retreat back to Washington, D.C. And again, like I said, this solidified Jackson as a very successful general and got him a lot of respect. Other side of things, McClellan, you're going to see that McClellan was a very, very smart man, but unfortunately for him, he just wasn't very quick on pulling the trigger during the war in numerous different ways. And you see that's what is going to eventually lead to him being removed as a general. Now, Lee hoped to go on the offensive. He wanted to be able to embarrass Lincoln's government. Again, that might put pressure on Lincoln and the Republicans to maybe just try to get the war over with, maybe reconcile with the South or let the South just have their independence. So the Union troops would once again be defeated at the Second Battle of Manassas, which Stonewall Jackson would be there for that. Lee would move into Maryland. And unfortunately for Lee, a copy of his battle orders would be found by a Union soldier wrapped up in some cigars. And they would find these, they would take these to McClellan. But again, McClellan would be very, very slow to exploit this to his advantage. McClellan always had this thought in his mind that he was constantly outnumbered. And that led him to be very, very slow to act. Which is one of the reasons why he was not super successful as a general. So that leads us to the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, as it was called in the South. Lee at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland here had a very, very strong defensive position. So he was outnumbered 87,000 to 50,000 troops. But you're going to see the Confederate Army is able to hold off repeated attacks. Jackson would arrive a little bit late and help prevent Confederate defeat by reinforcing different spots on the line. After the battle, McClellan would allow Lee to retreat back to Virginia because both sides had suffered massive casualties on that day. And actually, the Battle of Antietam remains the single bloodiest day in U.S. military history because of the amount of deaths and casualties that you had on that day. Now, you might be looking at this saying, what side won the battle? Lincoln would proclaim this as a U.S. victory, although most historians agree that it was really inconclusive. Yes, Lee did retreat back to Virginia, but really no side either really, gained much ground in this. So, like I said, Lee claimed this a victory. He would be disgusted, though, with the performance of McClellan. He felt that McClellan should have pursued Lee, and he would fire McClellan and replace him with Ambrose Burnside. You can see Burnside there. If you ever wondered where the term sideburns come from, it came from Ambrose Burnside, because if you look at his face there, he's got some nice sideburns. Burnside would be defeated, though, later on in the Battle of Fredericksburg, another devastating defeat for the Union. He would resign, and Joseph Hooker would take over. And again, you see this revolving door of Union soldiers. Now, Lincoln would use this victory, as he called a victory, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Previous to this, there had been a discussion of escaped slaves. They were called contrabands, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit later. The radical Republicans, as they would known to be called, wanted to destroy slavery. Now, Lincoln takes a first step with this measure, the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation would free the slaves in the rebelling areas of the South, basically anywhere that was not under Union control. You might wonder, why did Lincoln do this? Well, for one, he couldn't free slaves in all of the country. The areas that were under Union control, a lot of those being border-controlled areas, his concern was that if all the slaves were freed, that would lead to the border states wanting to leave the Union. So he didn't do that. Also, Lincoln personally didn't think that he had the ability as president to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He did it anyway. And if you think about it, he's issuing a proclamation, which at the time technically is dealing with a foreign nation, being the Confederacy. So really, you could say the Confederacy looked at it and said, this is a joke, and just threw it away. But again, that's a misconception that people have, is that the Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves. That's not true. That would not happen until the 13th Amendment would be passed. It also allowed for African Americans to fight in the Union Army. This is something that Frederick Douglass had pushed very strongly for. And it also kept Great Britain out of the war. Queen Victoria had been very, very interested in supporting the Confederate cause. But at this point in history, Great Britain had outlawed slavery, and they didn't want to make it look like they were fighting in a war to support slavery. And again, this is some shrewd political type stuff that Lincoln is doing. Because remember, at the beginning of the war, Lincoln said it's about keeping the country together. With transitioning, kind of shifting to the Emancipation Proclamation, it's making it look more and more like slavery, and the elimination of slavery is his goal. So some quick leaders during the war. Of course, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, said at the beginning of the war he was fighting to sustain the Union. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, former Senator, Secretary of War, and he had been in government for much of his life. Ulysses S. Grant, who would be the final Union general at the end of the war, who would be able to have some success. He had had success early in the war in the western part, and that would be what gets Abraham Lincoln's attention. Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, we've talked about him before, how he did not support secession, but he decided to join the Southern cause because of his allegiance to Virginia and his disagreeing with Lincoln over the calling of troops. Frederick Douglass, prominent abolitionist, and he urged Lincoln, again, to allow former slaves to fight in the Union Army, which is going to be the influence on the Emancipation Proclamation and why you are going to see that happening. So, as we again talk about, we already mentioned contraband, and you're going to see this term was come up with in 1861 by General Benjamin Butler. He was stationed at Fort Monroe, Virginia, which we have talked about before, and he started calling escaped slaves that came to the fort contrabands. Lincoln disagreed with Butler doing this because Lincoln didn't believe that slaves as property could be seized by the government in such a way as this. Lincoln said, hey, secession is illegal. Virginia is still part of the Union. And so because these, even though they would call themselves Confederates, they're still U.S. citizens, we can't just take their property. Butler disagreed with this, and he refused to return the slaves because he said, hey, Virginia is no longer part of the Union, meaning that they should be considered contraband of war. Now, while Lincoln disagreed with this practice, he didn't do anything to stop it, and you would see that hundreds of contraband camps would be set up in the South during the Civil War. War in the West. The Union goal was to control a lot of the major rivers. You're going to see as part of their Anaconda plan, it was to really stifle and cut the South off from trade. Cutting off the rivers would do that. You're going to see that in the western front of the war, the Union would have a lot more success than they would in the eastern part of the war. General Grant would have a lot of success. At the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, Grant is surprised by the Confederate Army, but defeats Confederate Generals Johnston and Beauregard there. This battle had a high number of deaths, which Lincoln, despite that, he was pleased with the victory and the solid victory that it would be. So in April of 1862, you're going to see the Confederate Congress, which would institute the first draft in American history. And there are going to be two exemptions to this draft. One, that one white man for every 20 slaves owned. So if you owned a lot of slaves, you could be exempt, or you could hire a substitute to take your place for this. And again, you're going to see sometimes the Civil War is called the rich man's war that's been fought by poor men. And I think this is a great example of that, because if you had a lot of power and influence, you could avoid the war. You're going to see some states in the South actually refuse to send troops or enforce the draft because they didn't like this. They felt like it was an overreach by the Confederate government. Less than 3 weeks after the Battle of Shiloh, you're going to see New Orleans would be captured by the Union Army. New Orleans was the largest of the southern cities and the financial center of the South. Again, this would be devastating for the South. And New Orleans there, right at the mouth of the Mississippi River, pretty much meant that the South had lost control of the Mississippi River as well. You will see that slaves in the area start to refuse to work on plantations without pay as well. Now, you're going to see the Civil War is going to be kind of mark a shift in war because the Civil War is going to be considered a total war, meaning that all resources and manpower from each side would be used. This meant that you needed a strong central government to manage all the resources, which would be a problem for the South because the Confederate government was set up purposely not to have a overbearing federal government. You will see that the South would have an easier time recruiting troops than they did in the North. As the war dragged on, though, both sides needed a lot of help. You're going to see by the end of the war, when you get into 1864 and 65, the South is really, really going to struggle with finding people to fight in the war. As far as the Northern draft, you will see, again, Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus, imprisoned 15,000 people without trial. Martial law was extended to civilians that refused to obey the draft. In the Militia Act of 1862, that actually set up the recruitment numbers and enticed volunteers with cash bounties. Again, just as in the South, wealthy people could basically pay their way out of the war or provide a substitute. The Enrollment Act of 1863, that would be what began the draft in the North. And this would be protested across the North, especially by German and Irish immigrants. In July of 1863, immigrants would protest in New York City. You actually see blacks be lynched and some Republicans' homes be sacked. A lot of the immigrants in there did not like the idea of that they were fighting a war to free slaves. That was just not something they wanted to get behind. And you're going to see a lot of people in the North were very, very upset by this idea of wealthy people could pay their way out of the war. Women in the war effort, you're going to see that women did volunteer as nurses during the war effort. You also have women that serve as spies on both sides during the war. As far as being nurses, you're going to see that during the Civil War, that disease infection is what is going to kill more soldiers than bullets actually would. If you look at this chart right here, it shows by state, and the red there shows the death by disease. And you're going to see that overwhelms the death by actual battle deaths there. So again, you're much more likely to die of a disease. And again, we're at this point in history, people don't know about germ theory, and there's a lot of poor sanitation and all kinds of stuff throughout the war. Southern soldiers, some of them died of scurvy because of the lack of vitamin C. Now, you would see 200,000 women would work on a sanitary commission, and in the Freedmen's Society, women would also work on the family farms and work in factory jobs while their husbands were away at war as well. So women did have a vital role in the war effort. Now, when you're looking at the resources in the war, you're going to see that the Union had a ton of advantages in the war. The Union had a higher population. They had more railroad. As we talked about before, they had 90% of the industrial output of the nation. So simply put, the North could outproduce the South. The South did have some strong industrial capacity in Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, but really the South was left doing a lot of purchasing weapons and that kind of things from Britain. The South was constantly doing raids to try to get Union equipment to help with that. And really the big thing that the South was counting on was on King Cotton and their connections with Britain and France to be an advantage. But if you just take a minute to look at this chart here at the bottom and look at the advantages there, really the only thing the South had an advantage in was cotton production, which would be good at the beginning because there was a lot of money in that. But as the war went on, that influence is going to wane there. So when you're looking at resources, really the South was at a huge disadvantage with population and a lot of different things. And remember, population, we talked about all the immigrants coming into the North, they were not coming into the South. All right, so Republican economic policies, you're going to see government-led economic development. They raised tariffs, created a national banking system, nationally financed system of internal improvements. So a lot of these old things that were part of the American system under the Whigs are now going to reemerge as the backbone of Republican economic policies during the war. Another thing you're going to see the Republicans do is push to build a transcontinental railroad, as well as pass the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave free land in the West to anybody that moved out there and would work the land for 5 years. You're going to see that during the war, that's not going to be huge, but after the war, as people move farther out west, the Homestead Act is going to be very, very important. Raising money for the war, you're going to see in the Union, again, they increased tariffs, had high excess taxes. Basically, taxes had to go high to help support the war effort. They sold off bonds. Also, in 1862, they printed greenbacks that were accepted as currency throughout the nation during this time. You ever wonder where the green color of our money comes from? This is where it got its start. As far as the South, how did they raise money? They borrowed a lot of money, but that would become more difficult as the war effort dragged on. As it became more and more apparent that the Confederacy was going to lose the Civil War, they could not find people to help invest in the war. Confederacy was forced to print money to finance 60% of the war effort, which led to massive inflation. You can see here what the exchange rate on dollars looked like. And basically, you can see the inflation and what happened throughout the war, especially as things began going bad for the South. By 1865, prices were 92 times their 1861 level. And this led to a lot of social unrest in the South as people were very unhappy as the war continued on. So 1863 would mark a turning point in the war. Lee defeated Hooker at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, which resulted in waning support for the war effort. You're going to see, though, at the same time, Grant will launch a major offensive on Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was kind of the last big stronghold on the Mississippi, Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. So the Battle of Chancellorsburg, going into a little bit more detail on that, that would be very, very important. That is probably, that is known as the greatest Confederate victory of the war. Lee, probably in his most brilliant strategic planning during the war, is actually able to have Jackson and his men march all the way around the Union Army without being detected. They're able to completely surprise the Union Army and crush them at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, the bad part of Chancellorsville for the Confederate Army would be that Stonewall Jackson, in all the confusion, night had come. Again, during the Civil War, you see they don't usually fight at night because, of course, they don't have electricity and that kind of thing. Lee or Jackson and his men were surveying the lines. There was confusion. A part of the Confederate Army from North Carolina, they thought it was the enemy. They would fire on Stonewall Jackson, injuring Stonewall Jackson. He would have his arm amputated and would end up dying a few weeks later, they believe, from the complications from that. So In the greatest of Confederate victories, you're going to see a massive loss for the Confederacy, which would be the loss of Stonewall Jackson, which is almost immediately going to affect the Army. Robert E. Lee would say, Stonewall Jackson has lost his left arm, I have lost my right. And that just shows the influence. Those two men worked very, very well together and almost had like an unspoken bond between them where they kind of knew what the other was thinking. So that brings us to the Battle of Gettysburg. June 1863, Lee, again, to put pressure on Lincoln, decides to move his army into Pennsylvania. And they would end up meeting in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Now, coming into this, the Union would take a superior hilltop positions in the battle, while Lee and the Confederate Army launched assaults on their position. Again, this is one of those areas where people believe that if Stonewall Jackson had been available, he would have been, or been alive, he would have been more aggressive in taking the superior hilltop position, whereas other Confederate commanders weren't as aggressive as he was. But still, so the Confederate push during this army is going to be to take on and launch assaults on those positions. In a final push on July the 3rd, Lee orders General Pickett and his 14,000 men to try to push through the Union lines. And they would fail in that. Actually, they would break through the lines, but overall, because of marching through the field, the losses they had, really in the end, it was all for naught, as the battle would be lost. Now, looking back, you can play what if with this all the time. A lot of people believe that Lee was actually trying to pull something similar to what he had pulled at Chancellorsville, but having a surprise to the rear of the Union Army, being General Jeb Stuart's cavalry coming into there, and that would fail. But nobody really knows because Lee didn't talk about the Battle of Gettysburg after it happened. This, of course, would be the bloodiest battle in American history. 28,000 casualties for the Confederacy, 23,000 for the USA. My great-great-grandfather, William Taylor, who fought for the Confederacy, he actually took part in Pickett's charge and survived, which is amazing to think about because if he had been shot and killed, I would not be here today. But really, the Battle of Gettysburg, they call this the high water mark of the Confederacy. So while the war does rage on for 2 more years, a lot of people believe that this was the Confederacy's last great chance at having victory. And if they would have had victory, maybe they would have been able to march right on to Washington, D.C., and possibly end the war by forcing Lincoln to recognize the Confederacy. So what would be the impact of Gettysburg? Lincoln would later, at the dedication of the cemetery there, issue his Gettysburg Address, a very short address, but in that he would state the new war aims of preserving the Union and defeating slavery. So now the war isn't just about preserving the Union, it's also about getting rid of slavery. Also, you're going to see that Southerners began to turn against the war effort, and the British started to become more dependent upon the North for wheat and impound Confederate ironclads that they had built. So you're going to see that British support starts to favor the North rather than the South. Now, also, so July 3rd, you have the victory at Gettysburg. July 4th, you are going to have the victory in Vicksburg. Grant had been laying siege to the city of Vicksburg for 6 weeks, basically starving them out. July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg would surrender. Union forces would take Port Hudson, Louisiana, 5 days later. So now the Union Army would have complete control of the Mississippi River. President Jefferson Davis wanted to send armies into Tennessee to draw Grant out of Mississippi, but Lee had believed that an invasion of the North would draw the Union to the east, or the Union Army to the east to take pressure off Vicksburg. Of course, none of that materializes. So, tide of war changes. The South still hoping to achieve a stalemate. You will see that African Americans begin serving in the Union Army as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, which provided an additional 200,000 troops for the Army. Lincoln often credited these people of color fighting for the Union Army as helping turn the tide of the war. You will see that there was still a lot of racial discrimination. Of course, black soldiers served in segregated units. Black soldiers were paid less than white soldiers. In 1864, you would see Lincoln, who places Ulysses S. Grant in command of the Union Army. And finally, he finds a capable general, and Lincoln himself also starts to take more of a direct role in leading leading the Army. I have some pictures here of the 54th Massachusetts, which would be the first Black regiment to fight in the Civil War. I highly encourage you to check out the movie Glory, which is a 90s movie about them. It has like Denzel Washington and a lot of other famous actors in it. Really, really good movie that kind of shows the struggle of what the first Black regiment went through during the Civil War. Now, Grant being in control of the Army, Grant was willing to accept heavy casualties in order to achieve victory. And that is going to be one of the big issues that people have with Grant and his own men had with Grant. He actually got the nickname the Butcher because of the massive amounts of death. But the way that Grant, the lens that he viewed it through is, look, we have all the advantages in the Civil War and we have the advantages of population. Now, he's not saying like, I just want to sacrifice people for no reason, but he is saying like, we have the advantages of people. We can overwhelm the Confederate Army. And yeah, we're going to have a lot of deaths, but also we're going to be killing a lot of Confederates, soldiers that they can't replace because they don't have the population that we do. So in 1864, Grant takes control of the Army of the Potomac and sets out to destroy Lee's army. He would instruct William Tecumseh Sherman to invade Georgia and to take Atlanta. Now, Lee fights the rest of the war in many battles, taking strong defensive position and only attacks when he has the advantage. And you're going to see that that leads to a lot of success for the Confederacy. Lee is able to win at the Battle of the Wilderness and at Spotsylvania courthouses. Both sides suffer very, very heavy losses, but again, the Confederacy is able to win these battles. The Wilderness Battle was especially terrible because in the Battle of the Wilderness, you're actually going to see the woods there catch on fire. So you're going to have a lot of wounded soldiers that die due to smoke inhalation or being burnt up, which is absolutely horrific. In 1864, you were going to have the siege on Petersburg. Morale on both sides would be weakened. Many troops desert, especially on the Confederate side. Grant lays siege to Petersburg, which is about 30 to 40 miles outside of Richmond and was a very, very important railroad center for the Confederate Army. And you're going to see that at this point in the war, we're going to have some foreshadowing of World War I because both sides dig in and start digging trenches. And you're going to see this happen in battles all throughout 1864, especially in Richmond, the Battle of Cold Harbor. You're going to have the Confederacy build trenches. Actually, both sides do it, but the Confederacy build trenches and able to be very successful. And you can see there in the pictures the trenches outside of Petersburg there. Now, one thing to consider in 1864 is that President Lincoln had run for re-election. He had faced re-election. He would actually be running against former General McClellan, who would be running as a Democrat. And McClellan would actually run on the platform of, hey, let's end the war by making peace with the Confederate Army or Confederate government and basically existing as two different countries. To put some pressure on Lincoln, in July of 1864, Jubal Early would lead a raid near Washington, D.C., forcing Grant to divert some troops from Petersburg. And Early would not be successful in his attempts to take Washington, D.C., but it did give notice to Lincoln as well as Grant. And as a result of this, Grant is going to order General Sheridan to turn the Shenandoah Valley into barren waste. And Sheridan is going to conduct basically scorched earth policy, destroying everything in his path. And you're going to see that Sherman is going to take the same policy in Atlanta and then going through Georgia. Grant basically says, hey, we have got to make it hurt for the South for them to finally want to give up in the struggle, because otherwise this war could go on for a very, very, very long time. And you're going to see that this notes quite a change in the treatment of civilians during warfare. So the election of 1864, like I said, Lincoln and the Republicans, they would change their name to the National Union Party. Andrew Johnson would be picked as Lincoln's new running mate or vice president. Andrew Johnson, who was a Tennessee slave owner and a Unionist Democrat, he was chosen again because he was from the South, so it was seen that he could help bring hopefully some Southern support. General George McClellan, he would run as a Democrat. He opposed freedom for blacks and Lincoln's war strategy. And again, he was very, very torn on the decision of ending the war and really wanted to end the war in many ways. The big thing that's going to help Lincoln in this is because a lot of people felt like that Lincoln probably wouldn't win this because of how the war was going and because of how long it had dragged on. Sherman would end up defeating General Johnston at Tennessee Mountain in Georgia and lay siege to Atlanta. And in September of 1864, you would have Atlanta fall to Sherman. Now, basically, Sherman called this his gift to Lincoln because a lot of people believe that because of the fall of Atlanta, that bolstered Lincoln's chances of winning and probably is the reason why people still support him in the election of 1864. Sherman absolutely destroys everything in Atlanta, destroys railroad, and it starts to become very clear in the fall of 1864 to Southerners that, hey, the war is probably nearing its ending. There is the election of 1864. You can see there, if you look at the popular vote, notice the popular vote, only about a 400,000 vote difference. So it was closer than it appears. And like I said, maybe without the fall of Atlanta, Lincoln wouldn't have won this election. So in January of 1865, Lincoln's win in the election, and because of the prompting of the Equal Rights League in Congress, or the Equal Rights League, led Congress to push to pass the 13th Amendment, which would prohibit slavery throughout the United States. Now, the amendment would still need ratification based on the qualifications of the Constitution, but the amendment had been passed. If you want to go through and learn the history of getting this amendment passed, watch the movie Lincoln. A lot of people with the movie Lincoln thought it was going to be a war movie, but really it is kind of a political thriller about everything that Lincoln went through to get the 13th Amendment passed and how he was really a brilliant politician and able in the way that he was able to get the 13th Amendment passed. Because I know I made it seem like it was very simple, but it was actually very, very difficult because there were still a lot of people in Congress that were not for freeing all the slaves. They wanted the country back together, but they didn't necessarily want the end of slavery. So Sherman's march to the sea, again, following with the idea of Grant and this whole idea of kind of laying waste to everything, Sherman would develop the policy of hard war, meaning that when one nation is at war with the other, all the people of one are enemies of the other. So Sherman believed in treating everybody in the South as a rebel combatant. So after the fall of Atlanta, Sherman did not follow the Southern Army and decided to instead go on a path of destruction through the South, all the way to Savannah, Georgia. This would become known as Sherman's March to the Sea. You're actually going to see a lot of Confederate soldiers desert the army to go home and protect their farms and families. And because of this March to the Sea, you're going to see that Sherman, for generations and generations, was known as a ruthless killer in the South, and a lot of people did not like him. And a lot of that has to do with things that his soldiers did. There were some instances of rape and that kind of thing. And a lot of people in the South hated Sherman after the war. Sherman would also issue special order, field order number 15, which set aside 400,000 acres of prime rice growing land in the South for the use of freedmen. And you're going to see by June of 1865 that blacks were cultivating lands which they believed to be theirs forever because of this special field order. And in January of 1865, Sherman would march through South Carolina using a lot of the same tactics that he had used in Georgia. Now, unfortunately, for the African Americans, the freed slaves who felt like that they had this land and that it belonged to them, this would actually be overturned at the end of the war, so they would lose their land and it would go back to their original owners. But this does mark kind of a change in U.S. policy here with giving land to African Americans. All right, so Confederate collapse. You're going to see by 1865, 100,000 men had deserted Confederate armies. Recruits would be very, very low. President Jefferson Davis would issue an executive order to enlist slaves who would earn their freedom if they fought in the Confederate Army. By April of 1865, you're going to see that the situation is bleak for Lee. At this point, Petersburg has fallen, and after the fall of Petersburg, Lee makes the decision that, hey, we have to abandon Richmond. The Confederate Army would actually set several things in Richmond on fire to prevent the Union Army from getting it, which would lead to a big fire within the city of Richmond. Lee's hope was to make it to Lynchburg. Lynchburg at the time, which had still pretty much been untouched by the Civil War, And Lynchburg had been a very, very important supply depot for the Confederate Army. So Lee hopes to get here to Lynchburg, be able to catch the train, and then maybe go to North Carolina and join up with the Confederate there. Following Lee's retreat from Richmond, he would be caught up with several times by Grant. The last major battle of the Civil War would be fought in Sailor's Creek, which is outside of Farmville, Virginia. That is where my great-grandfather would be captured and then taken to prison in Point Lookout, Maryland. So you have that last major battle. At that battle, pretty much a good majority of Lee's army was either captured or surrendered there. Lee makes it to Appomattox, Virginia, and realizes that his army is encircled and that he really has no other choice at this time but to surrender. So Lee meets with Grant. Grant is very generous with his terms of surrender at the direction of Lincoln. Lee would surrender April 9th, 1865. And by May, you're going to see that the whole Confederate Army was disbanded and no longer existed. And as I said, Grant, very cordial with his surrender at the direction of Lincoln. Confederate soldiers were allowed, again, very, very generous. Lee's army would have to surrender their arms, return home, and agree not to take up arms against the government of the United States. They actually allowed the Confederates to keep horses and swords. And Grant's philosophy on this, which is also Lincoln's philosophy, is the war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. And that's how they really looked at it is, hey, we're all Americans again. The end of the war shouldn't be about punishment and shouldn't be about retribution. It should be about rejoining together as one country. And you're going to see that similar terms of surrender would be given to all Confederate armies. My great-great-grandfather that was captured just 3 or 4 days before the surrender at Appomattox. He would be in prison in Point Lookout, Maryland until June of 1865, when he was eventually able to sign and agree to not take up arms against the Confederate or against the government of the U.S. and return back home. So what would be the effects of the war? You're going to see the South is absolutely devastated. At the end of the war, factories, warehouses, railroads, farms, and cities all were destroyed. You're going to have basically, the agreed upon number is around 700,000 deaths from the Civil War. Some people push it up to say that it's more closer to actually 800,000 deaths. But you're going to have a lot of people dead as a result of the Civil War. Thousands of soldiers maimed. And for once and all, we're going to have the question of slavery is going to be solved. That is not going to be a major policy issue anymore in the country, something we had been fighting over for hundreds of years, which now that issue was finally put to bed there. So again, we come to the end of this time where you're going to see that the nation is reunited here and is back together, but it comes at a huge cost to the country. And again, as we kind of reflect on the Civil War, again, this is why so many historians have so much interest in the Civil War, is because just what it meant for our country and what the legacy of the war would be. And often you can say the Civil War is really going to be judged by Reconstruction and what comes out of Reconstruction. And you're going to see that the plans that are pushed for after the Civil War, unfortunately, don't really go to help fix and help join the country back together. So again, I encourage you, do more research into the Civil War. There's so many different topics and things that you can get in and learn about the Civil War, from the people that fought in it to the people that led it and that kind of thing. So again, I hope you kind of enjoyed this. I know this video ran long, but again, this is a topic that has a lot of stuff to it. So yeah, I hope you have a great day and enjoyed learning a little bit about the Civil War.